Hello, everyone. And yeah, thanks so much to the organizers. It's been a really fantastic symposium. And I'm excited to tell you about some work I've been doing together with Joe Patton and Daniel McNamee here at the Champalimaud. So humans and animals constantly face the challenge of adapting behavior to ever-changing environments. Take this example. On our way to work, we might encounter a crossroad where typically we take a right turn. But if one day we find this road to be blocked, we have to adapt, which could mean to start to explore a series of left and right turns, or we could imagine our location with respect to the city we live in and mentally explore different possible routes. Our path choice also depends on our current mode of transportation, which we may adapt to weather and seasons. So these behaviors unfold over very different time scales, and they span different distances. Choosing how to avoid an obstacle is obviously very fast. Choosing a path might require a little bit more thinking, and adjusting habits based on seasons happens over months. Adaptive behavior is therefore not one process, but really a hierarchy of processes. And decision-making mechanisms must operate across these scales. Neural representations parallel the different spatiotemporal scales of behavioral interactions. Perceptions and movements are bound to concrete body-centric reference frames. On the perceptual visual side, I take vision as an example here, concrete, fast-varying local contrasts in the visual field are represented in primary areas. And they are turned into slightly slower changing object and motion coding by ventral and dorsal visual areas. This fast-to-slow hierarchy is paralleled on the motor side. For example, we have a motor cortex encoding detailed muscle trajectories, while supplementary motor area encodes the evolution of whole movement sequences. At longer spatiotemporal scales, neural representations become more abstract, with grid cells and place cells coding for allocentric as opposed to body-centric space in entorhinal cortex and hippocampus, and abstract sequential task structures that exist in frontal cortex. Representations of these abstracted environmental dynamics are often called world models and thought to be crucial for organizing long-term behavior. But what drives this abstraction and how world models emerge, particularly in cortical representations, is unclear. One approach to modeling how world structure emerges in the brain are neural networks trained on particular tasks, for instance, object recognition. These networks can develop neural representations that resemble cortical areas, but they do not explain how these decisions then actually become movements and why object recognition would be useful to guide movements. I hypothesized that spatial world models can emerge implicitly from the need to coordinate movements, and I want to connect these perceptual neural network models back to movement actions. So I take an inverse modeling approach towards world models. In inverse models, we start out with a desired sensory state. For instance, if we want to get to work, this could be standing by your desk, which differs from our current observation, which might be biking. So we need to create a sequence of actions to get from the current to the desired state. Now let me walk you through that idea in a very minimalistic toy model of a virtual rodent that is exploring a circular track. This rodent makes observations which are just high-dimensional position and direction-specific noise without any spatial information. So they are egocentric observations. And it takes, the rodent takes movement actions, which are either to go forward, so a go action, or a turning action, or to wait. So again, all those actions are relative to the rodent itself, so they are egocentric. However, even though the rodent observes and acts egocentrically, there is a latent allocentric structure that shapes its experiences, namely sequentially encountered observations that reflect the positions of the animal and that differ depending on the direction that it's facing. Now, while the agent is exploring its environment, the model here takes random start and end observations and learns representations by trying to predict the action sequence that connects these observations. So in this particular case, that could be that you have to turn around and then go forward to connect the start and end. Now use an encoder-decoder neural network framework to first encode the observations into a low-dimensional latent planning space, and then decode the action sequence from this planning space. And I hypothesize that abstraction emerges from two principles here. First, efficiency. The latent space here is a bottleneck, so it has to capture the essential information for predicting the action. And second, distances. I conceptualize the actions as differences between states, and I incorporate an inductive bias into the network that is a vector difference operator that is applied to the latent start and end state, so we take the difference between those two, and then the decoder uses those to predict the actions. And I hypothesize that this difference operator supports the representation of distances and further pushes the network to create meaningful abstractions. So I trained this network on data from exploration in the environment. And since observations are just high-dimensional position and direction-specific noise, if we map them into a low-dimensional PCA space, the spatial positions that we here see with the colors here, and then the gray lines are just the adjacent positions, they are completely unstructured because it is just noise. And the same goes also for the heading direction, which are the crosses and the dots. But we find that the trained models map these high-dimensional, unstructured observations into a very structured allocentric representation of the environment. So the models create these trajectories with ordered sequential spatial positions, and they place observations from the same position in space in the same position in the latent space as well. And this suggests that the trained models kind of develop a direction invariance and equidistance in this low-dimensional population space of the model, without ever having any explicit allocentric instructions being provided to them. So I'm now going to analyze this network, and I'm first looking at the single-cell features. So at the level of single cells, we see that if we look at the spatial autocorrelation of single neurons, they have this periodic structure where single cells sort of become active at different locations in the environment. And this periodic structure is the same for the two heading directions, so it's allocentric, and it really resembles grid cells in entorhinal cortex or place cells in hippocampus, which are two classic examples of internal world models of the brain. Further, we find that these cells develop periodic structure with varying frequencies, which again is something that has been found in grid cells and is thought to be crucial for coding there. Now, across the entire population, we can decode the spatial distances in this circle significantly well from the latent space of the model, which is something we can do from the observations. So with this, we want to kind of understand what are the components of this model that drive this abstraction. We first find that the abstraction in the latent space depends crucially on the action output space. So if we take models and we train them on allocentric action outputs, so where the actions would be just clockwise or counterclockwise movements in the circle, they do not develop this additional allocentric structure in the latent space, which is really interesting. We also look at the influence of scale here. So I take models and I train them to predict either exclusively short action sequences or also longer action sequences. And I find that the models that are trained on long action sequences develop much more of this allocentric structure. So the decoding performance of space increases with the maximum action sequence length of the model. And this is quite intuitive since we think of allocentric structure as something that's really important for this long-term planning. Finally, we're interested in relating these smooth trajectories that we see in the low-dimensional projections to the theory of straightening in sensory cortex. So the theory of straightening suggests that the brain aims to straighten experienced observations. Now, if we think of consecutive image frames from a natural video, they are highly entangled in observation or in pixel space, meaning if we look at sort of the trajectory of like the image points in the high-dimensional pixel space, the curvature of this trajectory is really large. But Hanaf and others found that if we look at the population latent space in visual cortex now, we see that there is an increasing untangling, so a linearization, so a straightening of the manifolds of this representation. And interestingly, these visual areas seem to straighten only natural sequences, but not if you scramble them up and have unnatural video sequences. So the straightening really reflects the dynamics of the experienced environment. Now, functionally, straightening has been linked to better prediction capacity, intuitively because it makes the manifold simpler. But how the straightening emerges is still unclear. And here, I propose that straightening could be driven by this action prediction. So I analyze spatial straightening in the latent space of our model, and I find that first, there is an increased straightening in the latent space compared to the observation space. Second, the models that are trained on longer action sequences show more straightening. And third, models straighten short distances less than longer distances. So to visualize this in this cartoon, the spatial trajectories seem to be more tangled on a short time scale than on a long time scale. Again, kind of like hinting towards that like on this long time scale, we need easier predictability. So just to summarize, we find that our inverse modeling approach promotes abstraction in the model latent space, and that this abstraction depends crucially on the action output space and on the spatial scale. And with this, I want to thank you all for listening.